Elena Brooks never imagined her name would be tied to a story like this, but life has a way of placing ordinary people in extraordinary moments. On that late summer afternoon, the heat pressed down over a small town like a heavy blanket, the kind that made even the pavement seem to shimmer. Elena had just finished another draining shift at the diner where she worked double hours to keep her young son Daniel fed and clothed. Her apron still smelled faintly of fried food and coffee. Her back ached from endless steps between crowded tables. And yet her mind carried a far greater weight: overdue rent, Daniel's long school supply list, and a paycheck that always seemed smaller than it should be. Her van, a rusted and weary thing that coughed each time she turned the ignition, had run too close to empty. She coasted into a gas station, praying she had enough change to stretch the tank until the end of the week. As she parked at pump number 4, the lot looked nearly deserted. She thought it would be a quiet, forgettable stop, but what unfolded there would not only test her courage, but also etch itself into her memory forever. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. At 10 minutes past her arrival, Elena Brooks still stood at pump number 4, her hand steadying the nozzle while her eyes scanned the horizon. The air hung heavy with gasoline and dust, the kind of quiet that makes a person believe they are invisible. But Elena wasn't invisible, and in moments she would learn how cruel strangers can be. From the sliding doors of the convenience store came 3 men: Ricky, Darnell, and Spike. They carried themselves with an arrogance that instantly shifted the atmosphere. Ricky crushed an empty soda can in his hand and tossed it aside without care. Darnell laughed too loudly at nothing, and Spike's eyes locked onto Elena with a glint that made her stomach tighten. They noticed her battered van, the faded paint, the back seat cluttered with old toys, and they smirked. Ricky sneered first, loud enough for Elena to hear, mocking the kind of car that only desperation could keep alive. Darnell joined in, pointing at her work uniform, and Spike leaned closer, taunting her for being alone at the pump. Their words landed like stones, each one reminding Elena of the fragile thread she was holding onto. When Spike suddenly reached for her purse dangling loosely from her shoulder, her body froze. Her grip on the pump tightened until her knuckles turned white. Her chest heaved, her heart racing against the silence of the empty lot. In that instant, her mind broke away from the present, pulling her into a series of painful flashbacks. She saw Daniel, just 7 years old, placing a list of school supplies into her hands that very morning, his hopeful eyes unaware of how impossible the list felt. She saw herself 3 years earlier, standing by the hospital bed where her husband had taken his final breath, leaving her to face the world alone. She saw the countless nights spent working until dawn, fighting exhaustion while Daniel slept in a small bed just feet away from the kitchen table, where she calculated bills she could never quite meet. Each memory clawed at her, fueling her fear, but also reminding her why she couldn't collapse. Elena knew Daniel was waiting for her at home. He needed her to be strong, even now, even as Ricky, Darnell, and Spike closed in, their laughter echoing against the hollow walls of the gas station. She glanced around desperately, but there was no one close enough to help. No friendly face, no bystander willing to intervene. The sun glared harshly over the cracked pavement, and Elena Brooks, alone and cornered, realized she had to stand her ground. What she didn't know was that the sound rising in the distance would soon change everything. The taunts of Ricky, Darnell, and Spike hung sharp in the air, their laughter bouncing off the stillness of that small-town station. Elena Brooks gripped her purse with one hand and the fuel nozzle with the other, her breath coming quick and shallow, her mind racing with thoughts of Daniel waiting for her at home. The men seemed ready to push further, to corner her with their cruel amusement, when suddenly the silence broke. At first it was faint, almost easy to miss, a low vibration rolling across the hot pavement. But second by second, the sound grew louder, heavier, a steady thunder that demanded attention. Ricky's laughter faltered as he glanced toward the highway. Darnell's smirk weakened. Even Spike, who had been so sure of himself a moment earlier, shifted uneasily. Elena turned her head and her eyes widened. What she saw was both intimidating and magnificent. One by one, motorcycles appeared on the road, chrome glinting in the harsh afternoon sun, engines roaring with a force that seemed to shake the very ground. Nearly a dozen machines rolled in, each rider clad in worn leather, their jackets bearing the unmistakable insignia of the Iron Brotherhood. They didn't just arrive. They descended like a storm, their formation tight, their presence undeniable. The thugs stiffened, their cocky arrogance draining away with every beat of the engines. Elena's heart pounded harder, but for the first time, it wasn't only fear. There was something else, something that felt like hope stirring inside her. The riders pulled into the gas station and cut their engines, leaving behind a charged silence. The leader moved first. He swung one leg over his Harley, the leather of his cut creasing as his boots hit the asphalt with weight and purpose. Grayson Hale, tall, broad-shouldered, a silver beard framing a face hardened by years yet steady with authority, fixed his gaze on the three men who only moments before had mocked a defenseless mother. Without speaking, he radiated command. His brothers followed, forming a half-circle around Elena, their sheer presence wrapping her in a wall of protection stronger than anything she had felt in years. Ricky, Darnell, and Spike looked trapped, their bravado melting beneath the heavy silence of the bikers. Ricky tried to laugh, but the sound cracked in his throat. Darnell muttered a weak excuse. Spike's mouth opened, but nothing came out. All three shifted on their feet like boys caught in a lie, stripped of the swagger they had flaunted just minutes before. Grayson Hale didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His piercing stare told them everything. Leave now, or regret every second you linger. That single look carried more weight than any threat, and in that moment, the thugs understood they had no power here. The silence was unbearable, stretched tight across the lot as Ricky, Darnell, and Spike stood frozen before the wall of leather and steel. None of them dared meet the eyes of Grayson Hale. His stare was unyielding, steady, and more powerful than any words he could have spoken. Ricky shuffled his feet first, mumbling something about needing to be somewhere else. Darnell tugged at his shirt collar, as though the heat had suddenly doubled. Spike's bravado was gone entirely. He wouldn't even lift his gaze from the ground. Without another taunt or smirk, the three men backed away, retreating toward their car like shadows running from daylight. Their steps grew quicker, almost stumbling over themselves as they yanked the doors open. Within seconds, the engine roared and their tires screeched against the cracked pavement, carrying them far from pump number 4 and far from the woman they thought would be easy prey. In their wake, they left only the stench of arrogance turned into cowardice. Elena Brooks finally let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her chest heaved, her hands trembled, and the adrenaline that had held her together began to crash. She clutched the fuel nozzle and then her purse, her body weakening as tears welled up in her eyes. For years, she had endured so much alone: the loss of her husband, the endless bills, the nights she cried quietly so Daniel wouldn't hear. But in this moment, with strangers standing tall around her, the weight of it all felt like it could finally come pouring out. Her tears slipped down freely, not of fear anymore, but of raw, overwhelming relief. The Iron Brotherhood didn't turn away when the danger left. They didn't mount their bikes or ride off into the horizon. Instead, they lingered, watchful and steady. One of the men stepped forward and without a word began topping off Elena's gas, adding more fuel than the coins she had scraped together could ever have bought. Another bent down under the hood of her tired van, tightening a loose connection, checking the oil, ensuring that this machine that carried both Elena and her boy could make it a few miles further without breaking down. Their actions were quiet, deliberate, and filled with a kind of compassion no one would have expected at first glance. Then, as Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, another biker approached. His name was Cole. Rough in appearance, his leather vest worn from years of travel, he didn't say anything. He simply pressed a folded set of bills into her hand and gave her a nod, walking away before she could even form the words to thank him. Elena stared down at the money, the paper soft against her shaking fingers. Her throat tightened again, but this time with gratitude so heavy it nearly stole her breath. Looking at them, Elena realized how her fear had deceived her. These men, whose presence alone could silence a parking lot, were not her threat. They had become her shield. Strangers who looked like danger had revealed themselves as her saviors, and in their quiet way, they gave her something she hadn't felt in years: the certainty that she wasn't truly alone. The roar of the thug's engine had already faded down the road, leaving only the quiet hum of cicadas and the heavy stillness that lingered after fear. Elena Brooks stood surrounded by the men of the Iron Brotherhood, her hands trembling as she tried to process what had just happened. She had expected to be humiliated, maybe even harmed, but instead she found herself shielded by men who could have easily ignored her suffering. And then Grayson Hale stepped closer. His boots echoed against the cracked pavement, and for a moment Elena felt small beneath his commanding presence. But when his voice came, it was not harsh. It was steady, low, and filled with something she had almost forgotten existed: reassurance. He looked her straight in the eyes, his silver beard catching the sun, and said simply, "Keep going. You're stronger than you know." Those words sank deep into Elena's chest. They were not a command, not pity, not empty comfort. They were a recognition of who she was and what she had endured. As the words echoed in her mind, Elena felt the memories she carried rising to the surface. She saw herself sitting at the kitchen table night after night, bills spread out before her, tears slipping silently down her face as Daniel slept in the next room. She saw the hospital room where she held her husband's hand one last time, her world collapsing in a silence no one else could understand. She saw Daniel's smile, bright and hopeful each morning, the single light that pulled her out of bed even when exhaustion threatened to consume her. Each memory was heavy, but in Grayson's words, she found a strange release, as though someone finally saw the strength it had taken for her to survive each of those days alone. Elena Brooks lifted her eyes and looked at the men around her. Their faces were hard, their hands scarred, but in their stance she saw no judgment. She saw respect. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a woman failing under the weight of her circumstances. She felt like someone worth protecting, someone who had fought too long alone but was finally reminded she didn't always have to. A quiet calm settled over her, replacing the trembling fear that had gripped her only minutes before. The bikers began moving back toward their motorcycles. Engines turned over with a low growl that built into a rolling thunder. Elena watched them prepare to leave, a strange ache forming in her chest. She wanted to thank them, to hold on to this moment of safety just a little longer. Grayson Hale turned one last time before mounting his Harley. He stepped close, placing a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. His eyes held hers, and with a final nod, he sealed the promise his words had already given her. She was not alone. Then he pulled away, joining his brothers as the roar of the Iron Brotherhood filled the station once more, preparing to carry them back into the horizon. Elena Brooks drove the old van down the familiar road back home, the fuel gauge no longer taunting her, her heart lighter than it had been in months. The fading sun painted the sky in streaks of orange and gold, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to breathe deeply without fear gnawing at her chest. When she pulled into the driveway and stepped inside, Daniel came running to her, his small arms wrapping tightly around her waist. Elena hugged him close, pressing her face into his hair, silently promising herself that no matter what challenges tomorrow held, she had the strength to face them. Tonight she felt it more than ever. The memory of Grayson Hale's words echoed inside her. "Keep going. You're stronger than you know." It wasn't just about surviving another day. It was about believing she was more than her struggles, more than the empty pockets and sleepless nights. The kindness of strangers, men she might once have crossed the street to avoid, had reminded her that strength doesn't always come from standing alone. Sometimes it comes from those willing to stand beside you, even for a moment. As Daniel laughed, telling her about his day, Elena realized she didn't feel invisible anymore. She felt seen. She felt respected. And though the Iron Brotherhood had roared off into the distance, their presence lingered like a shield she could still carry with her. In a world that often felt cold and cruel, she had been reminded that courage, kindness, and the will to stand up for the vulnerable still exist. And now, I want to ask you, if you had been there that day at the gas station, would you have stood up for Elena the way the Iron Brotherhood did? Do you believe moments like this, where strangers protect the vulnerable, can still happen in today's world? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming true stories.